Hi everyone, this is Patrick. Thank you for coming to my channel. So on this episode of Millennial Finance 101, we are doing econ, microecon, and it's going to be the first of a long series of principles of microeconomics, and I'm also going to do a macroeconomics class. So I've been a tutor for 10 years at the college level, and I'm going to give you all the tricks and the practice questions spread out through this video to help you ace your exam. So I know you guys are having a hard time learning all this information and it's tough, but I hope these videos will get you through it. So let's get started. In today's lesson, we're going to review the law of demand as well as the reasons why the demand curve is downward sloping. That includes the income effect, the substitution effect, and diminishing marginal utility. So that's a great short answer question you may see. And as always, we'll finish the lesson with a couple of practice questions with step-by-step explanations. And again, don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you have any questions or want to see anything in future videos, please leave a comment below. Before we start graphing, there's a couple other things that are very common questions that your teachers will ask you that you should commit to memory or knowledge, right? So one of the most common questions that you get asked is, why is the demand curve downward sloping? So if we were to draw a demand curve, it's going to look like this. So we have our general graph like this, and our demand curve is always going to look downward sloping, right? So always here, our vertical axis is always going to be our price. We're going to use P for that. Our horizontal axis is always going to be quantity. We're going to use a Q for that. And now here we have a downward sloping demand curve. So one of the questions is, why is the demand curve downward sloping? Well, I'll give you the theory question for it, and then I'll give you 3 factors for you to remember. The reason why it is downward sloping is very simple. Let's use 2 imaginary examples. Let's say we have a point right up here, and we have a point right up here. If we were going to find the corresponding price, let's say we're going to call this $20. And if we're going to find the corresponding quantity, let's say it's going to be $10. I just made up these examples just for illustration purposes. We're going to call this point X1. Now let's try and figure out what the P and Q is for this one. Again, I'm just going to create values for illustration purposes. For this new point here, X2, let's say it's going to be a quantity of 25. And it's all very relative, but the only main thing to remember is that you see the quantity here has to increase, right? The number will get bigger the further along on the horizontal axis you go. And now we'll say that the price for this one, let's say it's $12. Wow, this graph illustrates here, if the price decreases from 20 to 12, the quantity demanded will increase. Now, that's a good example. So when we're talking about the law of demand, it tells us there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity. Basically, as prices go up, quantity goes down, and vice versa. That's why this is downward sloping. We briefly talked about why the demand curve slopes downward, but now let's focus on the 3 elements that actually cause this. And you will hear about this a lot. This actually sounds like a possible written short answer question, so definitely keep this in mind. The 3 things that actually explain why the demand curve slopes downward are the income effect, the substitution effect, and something called diminishing marginal utility. So let's talk about each of these really quickly. The income effect basically explains how your changes in consumption are related to your changes in income. Now, it doesn't necessarily tell us quantity, but it more so pertains to quality. So let me give you an example. There are basically 2 types of goods that we have here. We have normal goods, and we have inferior goods. A normal good is basically what we know on a regular everyday, but a branded type of good. So if we think of a normal good, we can think of it as a branded good. If we are thinking of an inferior good, the easiest way to remember it is an unbranded good or a generic good. If you have an increase in money, if you have an increase in income, you are going to buy more normal goods and you're going to buy less inferior goods, right? You'll start splurging on more quality instead of quantity. If you have a decrease in income, right, you're going to buy less normal goods and more inferior goods. So basically, the income effect shows you how you change your spending habits based on consumption. The income effect says that if your income stays the same and prices fall, you're still going to buy more because relative to the price, you can now afford more units of something. So that inverse relationship that we see here, price is falling but you still buying more stuff, that's why we have a downward sloping demand curve. The next example we're going to dive into is the substitution effect. Now, remember how I mentioned how the income effect is related to your income changing your consumption, right? The substitution effect is very similar, but it relates to prices. So basically, the substitution effect is saying how your buying patterns will change when prices change. More specifically, if the price of a good increases, consumers will substitute the good for a cheaper alternative. So, substitution, again, relates to price. So let's use an example of outsourcing as another alternative. Companies, instead of hiring people domestically, may choose to outsource their employees or workforce in a foreign country where it is cheaper, right? So that's an example of the substitution method. Because the price of wages in the United States is higher, the company is going to substitute for cheaper labor alternatives elsewhere. The substitution effect says that if prices rise, consumers are going to look for a cheaper alternative elsewhere, right? They're going to look for a better deal. So when prices rise, the quantity demanded for the original good, that's going to decrease. So again, we're looking at an inverse relationship, and that's what we need to prove why the graph is downward sloping. The last one we're going to talk about is diminishing marginal utility. Now, diminishing marginal utility, we should break that up into three different words. So diminishing means less, right? Becoming smaller. The word marginal in economics means one more, right? So anytime you hear the word marginal, always think one more. And then utility can be considered happiness. So diminishing marginal utility explains how your happiness changes by consuming one more unit of a good. The law of diminishing marginal utility says that as you buy more of an item, you tend to enjoy it less and less. So a rational person will pay less for the additional items that they're going to buy. That shows an inverse relationship. As you're buying more, you're paying less, and that's what we need again to prove why it's a downward sloping demand curve. So all of these three elements here, the income effect, the substitution effect, and diminishing marginal utility are the reasons why the demand curve is downward sloping. So let's start with an easy question. A corn farmer who receives all his income from corn sales experiences a price increase and is known to eat more corn as a result. So what can we conclude about this corn farmer? I'll give you a couple seconds to think about it. The answer for this one is that corn is a normal good. And we know this because as prices increase, his consumption increase. If it was an inferior good, as prices increase, he would have bought less of it. We haven't discussed anything about luxury goods, so that won't be an answer. And then option D is there just to throw you off. You guys can definitely do this question, but I recommend going through all the options and marking off the ones that you know are not right. So I'll give you a few seconds. This one was a little bit harder, so let's go step by step. If the price of a good increases, then can the demand of the complementary good increase? Well, if these two goods are used together, the price of one good should decrease the demand of the complementary good because it makes it more expensive to do both. Option B and option D also cannot be the right answers because anything that changes price does not change actual demand, but in fact quantity demanded. We touched upon that briefly in the previous video, but any price changes only refer to quantity demand, not actual demand. So our correct answer is going to be C, and this is straight from what we just discussed. Substitutes will be affected. Now, I personally hate questions like these because they don't necessarily demonstrate knowledge, they demonstrate that you've actually studied. So try and work this one out yourself, but this may be one that's easier to remember. As I mentioned before, this one kind of sucks. I feel like this is a question that your teacher will definitely ask you, and they will have it in their notes, and it's just something that's easier to commit to memory. When I explain it to you, it'll make sense, but I think reading the question standalone, it sounds so vague. So the answer for this one is going to be false. For normal goods, the income effect and the substitution effect, they work in the same direction, which is to say, when prices decrease, it'll result in an increase in quantity demanded. But for inferior goods, it's going to be the opposite. So that is just something that's easier to commit to memory, that for normal goods, income and substitution effect work in the same direction, but for inferior goods, they are opposite. Thank you guys for listening. I hope this helped. Please don't forget to subscribe, comment below, and I look forward to seeing you guys at the next video.